Hello, Nina. Welcome to our Young at Heart gathering. Thank you so much for talking to us about the connection between autism and spirituality. I'm going to hand over to you now when you're ready.
Yes, hello. I'm now figuring out how to share my screen in real time. We did practice this, but it finds a new way of. Oh, is that working now?
Yep, it's working. Just need to press.
Excellent. Yes. So from the top. Yes. So this is my presentation on autism and spirituality / mindfulness. One little thing that I want to point out before we actually start, a lot of spirituality iconography on the internet in general has a lot of rainbow colors in it. And I just find it quite cool that the autism community also has that. We really have a strong rainbow motif going on because of the concept of the spectrum and being on the spectrum, and that representing, a wide array of possibilities. So I just think it's cool. There's that little superficial thing there, which is not terribly relevant. But yes, onto the slides. I first have to explain what autism is, because I can't take it for granted that everyone knows. So autism is a neurological condition which is present from birth and which appears to be genetic. We don't know for a fact, but it looks like it is. It's not curable. It's incurable in the way that someone's sexuality is unchangeable. And it's not separate from who we are as people. If you are not autistic, then you are allistic. That's the word for a non-autistic person. And I think it's important to point that out because, it's not just that you're normal. If you're not autistic, there is a specific term for you. And I think it's important to point that out because if you're just the norm or the default, then there's a sense of superiority that comes with that. So you're not superior, you're just in a slightly different category. Important to note that we exist in every demographic. People quite often think of young white males when they think of autistic people, especially middle class white autistic young boys. But we exist in every demographic. There's elderly autistics, there's Black autistics, there's LGBT autistics, loads of those. There's just loads of us. We're everywhere, and there is no society that doesn't have us. The word autism itself comes from auto, which is Greek, and it means the self. And this is kind of connected to this idea that we're all very wrapped up in our own heads and we're kind of lost in our own world. And it's not necessarily true that we're self-absorbed, but I can understand why people may believe that. And actually, some of the things about us that make us appear self-absorbed can be potentially positive things, like the laser focus that I will talk about at the end of this session. Finally, autism is a spectrum, but this doesn't mean that everybody has it. People really seem to get confused about this. They say, oh, well, if it's a spectrum, I must be on it too. But the way I see it, for example, if you had sore feet and a sore back, you probably still wouldn't say, I'm a little bit pregnant. It's one of these things where you are or you're not. And if it's to do with a color spectrum and you want to be like, oh, well, all the colors are on the spectrum, it's like, well, that's not true either, because infrared and ultraviolet are not represented on the color spectrum. So just because it's a spectrum, that doesn't mean it encompasses everybody. When talking about how autism affects people, I usually split the effects into sensory, executive function, and social. We're only really going to be talking about the sensory effects today because I don't have all year to be explaining this stuff. So now we have to define what mindfulness is. Fortunately, this is quite easy because the internet is helpful and has kind of decided on a consensus of what it is that isn't too complicated. So mindfulness is a mental state which is achieved by focusing one's awareness on my face cam's away, on the present moment, while calmly acknowledging and accepting one's feelings, thoughts, and bodily sensations. used as a therapeutic technique. So that's all fairly straightforward and specific. But then we get to, well, what's spirituality, which is a lot vaguer. Really, actually, it's hard to find an agreement on what spirituality is or isn't. So I'm going to give you my personal definition, which I invented. My attempt at defining spirituality is a belief system and or set of practices which focus on nature and or art and or concepts such as a higher power, afterlife or souls in an attempt to induce tranquility or euphoria. So hopefully that is fairly understandable. And now I will try and tell you what autism has to do with all that stuff that I just said. In short, there is a concept called stimming, which is really, really important. And the word stimming, that's S-T-I-M-M-I-N-G, that comes from the word stimulation. And a little tiny definition of stimming is repetitive sensory seeking behavior useful for regulating emotions, not just negative emotions. So that probably sounds like it makes very little sense, but an example of stimming is this. Can't really get myself on the camera to do this very well, but it's kind of this hand flapping motion that we are very stereotypically associated with, where you basically your wrists are very loose and you kind of flap your hands as if they're the wings of a bird. That's one example of stimming. Another example of stimming is my phone going off. That's not actually. But when I say it can be any sensory seeking behavior, I mean it can be any sense. So with touch, you have the things like the hand flapping, but visually, if you spin around on the spot and make yourself dizzy on purpose, that can be a visual stimulation because it makes your sight go funny. And I've put on my slides here a demonstration because the idea is that I'm going to actually show everybody what this looks like. Now, we don't know if our recording setup is actually recording what I look like right now, but I will give you a demo anyway. And we can probably just paste something in if it turns out it's not being captured. But one example of a stim that I do is when I feel happy or excited and I'm in a standing position, I will have my arms straight out and I'll have my hands folded into fists and I'll kind of drum them against the sides of my thighs. So if I stand up, straight arms, just let's see, if I wiggle like this and then just do that, sort of like a penguin, that's an example of stimming. And I want to emphasize how radical and wild it is that I'm talking about this and showing it to you, because it's something that is so stigmatized and that is quite brutally trained out of most of us in at least one way or another, despite the fact that it's actually a really helpful tool for emotional self-regulation. It can help us when we feel overloaded. One more point on this slide is that everybody stims to a degree. We all know that person who, if they're bored in a meeting, they'll be doing that with their pen, click, click, click with the thing on it there. That's a stim. And you know, anyone who gets bored and bounces their leg up and down, that's a stim too. So I obviously see it from an autistic lens, and with that lens, I'm now going to go through each type of stimming, and I'm going to point out the parallels between these and some more conventional spiritual practices. So we're going to start with sight, very important sense in the artsy-fartsy world. Visual stimming is when you create and enjoy a sight, something that you can perceive with your eyes. And the first example I want to draw attention to on this slide is the photo on the bottom left, where you can see a lot of small, colourful plastic toys that an autistic child has lined up in a very creative way. They've created a complex spirally pattern with them. Lining up our toys or whatever in a way that looks cool to us is something that we stereotypically do as kids. It's something that's associated with us. And a lot of people think it's a bad thing. Like, oh, my child doesn't play with their toys properly. They don't do what they're supposed to do. But actually, in doing that, they're creating a beautiful work of art, which they can then enjoy just by looking at it without even needing to fool around with it. You don't just do this with toys, though. You can also just do this with things like light. The image in the middle, you could obviously see the sunbeams. I put them in there because a lot of us like to rock backwards and forwards, which I'm not going to do because it means nobody can hear me anymore. But a lot of us enjoy this rocking backwards and forwards, and one potential reason for doing this is that it makes the light do interesting things. It makes light play on things in an interesting way. So we do have the sensation of the rocking, but we also have the effect it has on how we see things, and that can be really cool in and of itself. Another example of visual stimming could be looking at something that's mesmerizing, like an open fire. I personally find myself staring into the washing machine sometimes, which has kind of a similar mesmerizing effect. A lava lamp is also effective. And finally, on this slide, I've got a fidget spinner, which we all know about those because they were kind of a fashion craze for a while. Playing with those, it's obviously very tactile, very touchy, but it looks cool as well. So I thought I would include it on the visual slide. And this is a good reminder that these categories, visual and so on, like I use these categories to make things easier, but they do overlap. You know, just because the toy is on the visual slide, that doesn't mean that it doesn't count as a tactile stim. It's both. A lot of them overlap in various ways. So what does this have to do with spirituality? Well, there are a lot of spiritual and religious practices that rely on sight um, and use visuals to inspire feelings. And one example that I really particularly love is the Buddhist sand mandala that you can see in the middle of this slide. These images are very complex, really colorful, beautiful, and they're made entirely out of sand, like very meticulously over days or weeks. And then they're simply brushed away and blown away. The whole point of them is to be temporary. And I really see the connection between that and the lined up arranged toys on the last slide. Because the point is not that it's supposed to be a permanent arrangement. The point is that there's joy in creating it and joy in looking at it. And, you know, for some people that's meaningful enough without it having to last. In fact, part of the point is the fact that it doesn't last. A lot of spiritual stuff uses color in a meaningful way, especially the chakras, which we see on the bottom middle of this slide. The chakras are usually grouped in terms of, from what I know, they're usually grouped in terms of colors as well as places on the body, in order to help people understand them better. And I forgot what I was going to say about that. Oh yes, it's not just color that's important here though, it's also light. I am not a chakra expert, but I know that when people are working with chakras in meditation, they often get people to visualize a light coming from a certain area of their body, for instance. And doing cool stuff with light is something that I've just been talking about. And it's something that happens in spirituality quite a lot. That's why we've got the candle flame there also. A lot of spirituality, a lot of religions use candles, not just for the cool way they smell, but also the mesmerizing way that they look. On the subject of color, I've also put some crystals in there because crystals for some people have various meanings. And those meanings, sometimes at least, seem to be informed by how the crystals look and what color they are. So for instance, you've got the fact that rose quartz is associated with romance, and it's pink, and we just seem to associate pink with romance, or at least over here we do. And clear quartz is associated with clarity. You know, simple enough, makes complete sense. Speaking of quartz and crystals, something I find very interesting is on this slide, and it's what looks like a maraca or a shaker. And it might be tempting to think, why the heck is there a maraca on the visual part of the presentation? Like, you know, that's a noise making tool, it belongs in the noise section. But this particular shaker is really special. This particular one and ones like it are made by the Ute people of America. They're what the state of Utah was named after. And the way they make their shakers is they have very thin buffalo hides, so it's almost translucent. And then they have quartz crystals inside the shaker. So when it's shaken in darkness, the quartz crystals bang against one another and produce flashes of light. And for them, this is really spiritually meaningful. And it makes complete sense because that sounds magical to me as well. Um, Finally, the reason I've got drugs on this slide is because drugs such as, the typical kinds of mushrooms and cannabis and other hallucinogens such as peyote are sometimes used as for religious purposes, really. And when people do have hallucinations that they interpret in a religious way, they usually emphasize the visuals. Um, Hallucinations can be other things as well. You can hear things or feel things when you're having a hallucination that are not real. But when people are having a spiritual experience and they're on a hallucinogen, it's usually the visuals that they find to be meaningful. So I thought they would fit best on this slide. So that brings us nicely to our first activity, which is going to be glitter jars. So I've just going to reach over and get my jar here. This one is a 500 milliliter jar, which is the kind of jar that this recipe here on screen was made for. You will have to modify it if your jar is a different size. Importantly, remember to fill it up only halfway at first and then mix all the other stuff in, and only then fill it up to the top. Because if you fill it up with water immediately all the way to the top, you won't be able to stir anything else in without it becoming a massive mess. Also, it's better if the water is warm because then the glue can dissolve into it. Other than that, you don't really need to remember much for this recipe. Just get the ingredients, roughly throw them together and see what comes out of it. So moving on, once we've had fun shaking our jars about and hopefully not getting glue all over ourselves, my kitchen counter's so messy I can't actually put my jar on it. But yeah, tactile stimming means stimming that's to do with touch. And this can take loads of different forms. In today's fascinating modern age, we have jewellery, which is chewable jewellery. In my day, we just had to chew on our pencils, basically. But nowadays, you can even get specially designed bracelets and stuff that are for chewing on. And also, obvious things like textures, running things through your hands. That's very much tactile stimming. Like this picture of the cute baby playing with dry rice. You've also got a cat, not just because I love cats, but because being with an animal is satisfying in so many different ways. You've got the companionship, but you've also purely got the sense of, being able to pet them and having that being a nice experience because they're so soft and lovely. But it's important to note that tactile stimming doesn't just rely on stuff or other people or other things. You can do it with your own body, and by that I'm talking about, for example, spinning on the spot is a really common thing that we do. Toe walking is a really common thing that we do. And as you can see in the bottom right hand picture, hand flapping, as I was describing earlier, is a really common thing that we do. And these things don't involve any props, if you like. They're just us, just our own body and enjoying being in our body. So how does that relate to spirituality? Well, the first thing I thought of when it came to tactile stuff and spirituality was these prayer beads, which actually seem to exist in most religions. Like most religions have an equivalent of prayer beads. These ones, the one at the top is a Buddhist monk holding the beads, and the one at the bottom is a Catholic holding the rosary. Even though these are very different faiths from different parts of the world, they both use these beads in a very similar way. You can run them through your hands and essentially count with them and use them for prayers or reciting mantras. So, for instance, if a Catholic is doing the rosary, they might say a Hail Mary for each bead that passes through their fingers. And that's a very calming thing. You can just close your eyes and let your sense of touch take over and get your mind into a very focused but calm place by doing that. But obviously you don't need other objects to do any of that. As with the last slide, you can do this kind of thing just with yourself. So yoga and Tai Chi, the lady on the slide is doing yoga. That's another example of an activity that can be secular but can also be used for spiritual purposes, and which very importantly is just about, you know, being in your body and feeling what it can do and enjoying it. Um, Dance is another aspect of tactile, not just stimming, but just tactile activity that can be spiritual. And there's two very different forms of dance represented here. The first one, which is the ancient Greek pottery of the lady who's bending over backwards, that's called ecstatic dancing. And what that is it's when you essentially go wild and you just do whatever the rhythm makes you do. You don't think about anything. You don't have any inhibitions. You really don't bring your rational mind into it at all. And this specific pot is showing an ancient Greek cultist of Dionysos, who was the ancient Greek god of wine and fun and festivities. So it kind of makes sense that his worshippers would choose this form of wild, uncontrolled, fun worship. Spiritual dance isn't always like that, though. On the bottom of the slide, we have a hula dancer, and hula, which is from Hawaii, is a very, very different form of spiritual dance in the sense that it is extremely controlled. Everything's very deliberate and it all has certain meanings. And because this dance is done in honor of the gods, if you're doing it at a religious ceremony, it's considered very bad luck to make a mistake, to accidentally do it wrong. So what they do is the dancers, in order to practice the dance safely without offending the gods, they do a little ritual before practice so that if they mess up, the gods know, oh, don't worry, they're just practicing. That's how tightly controlled it is. And I just find it really fascinating that we've got, you know, we've got these two examples of religious dance, and yet they're so different. And as it's been pointed out, any kind of dance can be ecstatic because the sheer joy of doing it and knowing that you can do it well is inherently joyous. So moving on. So this is olfactory stimming. Olfactory looks like a big fancy word, but it just means taste and smell, because I felt like there was no point in doing taste and smell on different slides. They have too much to do with each other. So this is about stimming that is to do with taste and smell. One way in which this can be done is essential oils, sniffing essential oils. These essential oils can potentially be put in a diffuser, like the one in the middle. That crazy rainbow looking thing is actually an aromatherapy diffuser, which looks extremely cool. Scented candles also are a really obvious example of something that can, you know, create a nice aroma and set a mood in that way. I just thought it was quite funny that this one was French baguette scented, just because, like, you know, what next? A bacon sandwich candle? But anyway, you'll also notice that I've included cigarettes and alcohol on the slide. This is not me intending to promote cigarettes and alcohol. It's simply me pointing out that cigarettes and alcohol are comforting to people, not just because they contain addictive substances, which they do, but also because they engage our senses in a comforting way. With alcohol, you've got the warmth that it brings you, the feel of it in your mouth, that slight burn. With the smoking, you've got the fact that your hands are engaged, so your hands have something to do, and you've got something to suck on. Like these are very old, primal, comforting things, and they actually do both come up in spirituality because of that, even if they're not necessarily a healthy thing to do. And I included them in Imperials because Anna was telling me about a guy in her church who sucked on mint to get the sermon and was very offended one day when the sermon lasted a bit too long and he ran out of mint. So yeah, I just thought that was quite sweet. So what does that have to do with spirituality? Well, all religions really use taste and smell in various ways. The really obvious example, and the one that involves alcohol, is Christianity and its communion ritual, where you eat a bit of bread or this bread-like substance and drink some wine. In order to think of Jesus and thank Jesus and so on. But one example of taste being used spiritually that I find really interesting is the Jewish Passover meal. The reason I find this so interesting is because the meal deliberately includes bitter herbs, and these are supposed to taste bad. They're not just being eaten because they're delicious. Their bitterness means something, and it's actually a symbol of the bitterness of slavery and how Moses and his people suffered under slavery. So I find that interesting because, obviously everyone has food and everyone knows that tasty food is good. But I find this idea of deliberately going out and finding something horrible and eating it to evoke a certain mood or get into a certain mindset, I find that really interesting. Smell obviously is also involved. At the bottom left, we have some very enthusiastic Orthodox priests swinging burning frankincense around to make the church smell nice. Similarly, we've got incense burning in a Buddhist temple, both again nice, sweet smells to kind of to create a relaxing atmosphere. And interestingly, we have a pipe, a smoking pipe. Now, this image on the bottom right is a ceremonial pipe, and it belongs to the Dakota people of North America. There are all sorts of tribes in North America that have ceremonial pipes. This one in particular just happens to be a Dakota one. And what they do is they usually smoke tobacco in it, but it can be other herbs. And they do this ceremonially for religious purposes, or when something important politically is happening. It's a ritual that they can partake in together. And it's in that sense it's quite comforting. Maybe it would be less comforting these days because they're communal pipes, and the idea of using a communal pipe during COVID is about the opposite of relaxing, but never mind. So on to auditory stimming. Auditory means stuff that we hear. So when I think of auditory stimming, I think quite often of humming, which is very easy to do. I used to do it sometimes at school without actually realizing that I was humming. Another thing that is really comforting is repetition. So quite often when we auditory stim, we may hum the same tune again and again, or sing the same line of a song repeatedly, or just speak the same words several times. The repetition is part of what makes it comforting. I've put an image of a hairdryer here because I don't know if this is just me, but I find the noise of the hairdryer quite soothing because it's so constant and because it's kind of like a nice background noise. It's like a canvas that can be painted on. So while the hairdryer is going, I can quite happily hum along and stuff without feeling self-conscious, or without feeling that without feeling that there's this deafening silence that's kind of soaking up what I'm doing. Obviously, if you crave auditory stimulation, a very easy thing to do is to listen to some music. But I've put a picture of a river in also because a lot of people, not just us, but a lot of people in general, find it really relaxing to listen to nature sounds. So like the sound of a river, sound of rain or thunder, sound of bird song, all sorts. People will deliberately listen to that to bring themselves to a relaxed frame of mind. And finally, I've put an actual instrument in because if you're lucky enough to go out to play an instrument, then one really cool, relaxing thing to do can just be to go wild on the instrument. I can't really play piano, but whenever I get a hold of one, I will happily play some tunes that I made up on the black keys. I only ever play the black keys of the piano because I think they're the ones that sound the most beautiful. And I went to a very strange hippie school, which only allows the lower school kids, the younger kids, to play on the white keys and won't let them play on the black keys. And I'm very glad in a way that I didn't go to Steiner school when I was a young child, because I would have definitely been highly annoyed at not being allowed to play on my favorite piano piece. So what does that have to do with spirituality? Well, sound is used a lot in a heck of a lot of different spiritual contexts. These are only some examples. That goes with every slide, by the way. I've only chosen my favorite examples. If I chose all the examples from every place, I think we'd be here for the next year or so. The very lovely image on the top left there is an image of a shaman from Siberia playing a drum and singing and dancing. And shamanism itself is quite an interesting thing. The word shamanism is very like the word paganism in that it's extremely vague. It basically amounts to religions that have an emphasis on using music and dance in order to go into a trance-like state. Sometimes drugs are also involved. But there's a real emphasis on the trance and the going into the trance, and a lot of what's involved with bringing you to that trance-like state is the rhythmic drumming music and singing. Um, the image there in the middle at the top is a Tibetan singing bowl, which you might hear in Buddhist temples and such like. Their sound is very relaxing. We've obviously got the typical gospel choir here. And I think the nice thing about a choir is that, you know, the people who are in the audience on the pews, if you like, can benefit from the choir just by hearing the singing. But it also really benefits people who are in the choir themselves, because they can hear themselves and how they sound, and and it can really, it can really elevate your mood. I've never been in a religious choir, but I have been in a choir. And it is a nice experience. You get the sensation of singing, and you also get the sound surrounding you. I put in at the bottom left, I've put in a little image of the Muslim call to prayer, which usually takes the form of a man singing. There are other equivalents in other religions, like, for example, Christianity will have the church bells ringing. These sounds are quite often used as examples of sounds that make people feel serene. On the bottom in the middle, we've got a meditating person. This person has what's called an Om symbol inside their chest. Now, the Om is where, if you're meditating, what you might do, if you want, is to take a deep breath and go, oh, for as long as you possibly can, basically till you run out of breath. It's something that I think people see as quite comical if they don't know what it's about. But there is a reason that it's done, and it is partly for that sound, but it's also because making the sound stimulates a nerve called the vagus nerve. That's not Las Vegas; it's VAGUS. And doing that, stimulating that nerve, can make you calmer, because that nerve is really important. It runs through our entire body. It does all sorts of cool stuff, and it's really got a lot to do with how we feel. Now, the word mantra is probably something that you are familiar with, but the definition is a sound, word, or phrase that is repeated by somebody who's praying or meditating, or a word or phrase that is repeated often, or that expresses someone's basic beliefs. It's a fairly vague definition. A lot can fit into a definition of mantra, and it's quite cool to me that something we do in the form of repeating ourselves when we're stimming auditorily can also be seen as a kind of mindfulness exercise. One of my personal examples is when I had a terrible hallucination that I was trapped in time. I said to my husband at the time, "I'm getting a taste of what infinity is." And at that moment in time, it was really horrible, because I felt like I was stuck, and that well, I was essentially like trapped forever in a terrible place. But nowadays, I've found that the sentence, I'm getting a taste of what infinity is, has quite a nice rhythm to it. So I find myself just casually like singing, like, I'm getting a taste of what infinity is, and singing that same line again and again. And it turns something that was horrible into something that's actually relaxing and beautiful. And the repetition, which was horrible at the time because it was kind of echoing around my head, the repetition is now a comforting aspect of it because it doesn't have to stop, but it can be stopped. Um, and I don't know if I've done a good job of explaining that, but I think that us autistic people are quite good at getting something that's horrible and actually making something really beautiful and cool out of it. So this is where we would do an activity if I wasn't talking for so long. So sensory painting is something I think I came up with by myself. I may have subconsciously stolen it, but what I'll do is I'll describe the activity so you can give it a shot in your own time. So you'll see we put 4 senses on this slide. It's sound, texture, smell, and taste. And you'll notice that sight is not there. That's because sight is used so much in art, and we all know what it's like to see something and try and draw it. But we don't necessarily know what it's like to smell something and try and draw the smell in a way. So my idea was just take any object around you, literally any ordinary household object. For me, it would be that jar of peanut butter over there. And think about it in terms of, for example, say texture and taste. If we're going with the peanut butter, like think about the chunky texture of it, the creaminess combined with the chunks of nut. And God, that sounded wrong. And think also about the taste. You've got the savory notes, you've got the crystals of salt, you've got the subtle sweetness behind it. How would you put that onto a page? What colors would you use? What shapes would you use to convey all that? And forget about sight. Just try that for yourself at home. Doesn't have to be peanut butter, it can be literally anything. And try and think about ways to convey things through these other senses that don't involve your eyes. Because your eyes do enough work already and they do enough art already. It's good to give them a back seat sometimes and let the other things shine through. But moving on from that, we've covered all the senses now basically. But I'm still not quite done because there are some other aspects of autism that are to do with spirituality in some way. And one of them is the importance of rituals. So, what is a ritual? Well, it's a sequence of activities involving gestures, words, actions, or objects performed in a particular place and according to a set sequence. So, you'll notice that that's really vague. It's just some stuff that's done, usually in the same place and in the same order. There's nothing in that definition about religion. People usually think of religion if you say the word ritual, but that doesn't really have to be involved. And for autistic people, we are really famous for relying heavily on routine and familiarity. These things are really important to us because they help us navigate a world that can be very chaotic, very unpredictable, very overwhelming. Rituals give us a sense of structure. There's something calming in that way. So obviously rituals can be spiritual. You will have probably thought of some spiritual religions. Spiritual rituals, as I've been talking, not just about sacrificing goats, just other simple ones like communion we've already discussed. But honestly, a ritual can be something as simple as making a cup of tea. That's why I've put a nice wee image of a cup of tea. It really doesn't have to be any more complex than that. And for those of us who love routine and familiarity, rituals can be really important to us with or sans the spiritual part. So this is the final thing I'm going to spraff at you for before we move on to the Q&A, and that's monotropism. Monotropism sounds like a big, scary, hard to understand word, but it's probably easier to understand if you think of it as autistic laser focus. Autistic people's attention tends to be tightly focused, like a laser beam rather than a lantern light. Normal people, quote marks, holistic people usually have attention that kind of hits most things at once. They can focus superficially on multiple things. Whereas we have a tendency to have very, very deep, intense focus on one specific thing at a time. And people see that usually as a negative. They say, it's a bad thing that autistics do this because it means that they find it hard to watch someone and pay attention to what they're saying. It's easier to absorb what someone says if you don't have to also look at them. And people will say that that's a negative. But I would argue that our monotropism, our laser focus, can actually be incredibly useful, incredibly positive when you think about things like mindfulness. Remember when we defined mindfulness? Go back and look at it if you don't. But imagine engaging with mindfulness whilst having this incredible focus, this incredible, very narrow but very intense focus. That can allow you to get very, very deeply into something whilst not necessarily being pulled out of it by other stuff. This is why I'm so surprised that more people haven't really talked much about autistic people and spirituality. And one theory I've got about that is that we're not always necessarily made welcome in spiritual or religious spaces. And I don't think this is deliberate. I don't think most people wake up in the morning and go, I'm going to exclude some disabled people today. But when it comes to us and some of the weird things that we do, like stimming, like flapping our wrists, it's very easy for people to look at that and go, that's weird, that's disruptive, that's not welcome in my space. But if that's how someone relaxes, and if you can just, ignore it and close your eyes if you don't like it, then actually it really should be welcome in your space. Because if you're excluding people who relax in a different way to you, then you're potentially missing out on quite a lot. You're missing out on a lot of different perspectives. And we're missing out because, well, we don't get to relax without feeling that we're somehow doing it wrong. One example of this was when me and my husband went to a group gong massage type setup where there was a whole group of us in a room with yoga mats lying down, and some gongs were sounded and the vibrations went through us, and it was supposed to be relaxing and it was all right. But my husband said, "Oh my God, that was so stressful because I really badly needed to cough that whole time and I couldn't do it." And I was like, "Oh goodness, like you should have just done it." But it hadn't been made clear to him that he was allowed to. So he thought he had to hold it in. And imagine how stressful that is. That's the opposite of relaxing. And it wasn't really anyone's fault. Nobody had told him that he must hold back his coughs, but nobody had made it clear that that kind of thing was allowed. So I think that's just something to be aware of if you're trying to create a relaxed space. On to the Q&A. So when we do this session that's not being recorded, this is where people will ask me questions in person, I hope, if they have questions. And if they are too shy to ask me any questions, then I've put my personal email there as well. And it's at this point that I want to credit Amaze, which is the Autistic Mutual Aid Society of Edinburgh, for helping quite a lot. Their website has helped me quite a lot coming up with these slides. And they have a very useful glossary of terms. So if you're unsure still about what stimming is, or if there's any other autism related term that you don't know, just go on their website and have a look at their glossary. It's incredibly useful. I think it's under their resources page, and having a read of it, it might blow your mind. But yeah, that's everything from me, unless there's anything I've forgotten to say. And I'm ludicrously excited to do this again with an audience this time.
Thanks, Nina. I have a question for you. When did you get diagnosed with autism?
So my diagnosis was when I was 10 years old. And that sounds young, but it had actually taken a very long time. I I was a 2-year-old when my parents started noticing that I might be autistic. But there was a gap of 8 years between them realizing and me getting diagnosed because I was, well, for one thing, I was a girl. And back in the 90s, autism was still considered a boy's condition. So it was very difficult for a girl to get any kind of autism related help or diagnosis at all. Um, so yeah, I was 10, and even though that does sound young, it meant that I had to go for years through my childhood without receiving any kind of help or understanding. And it also meant that I was lacking a little bit in self-knowledge. If I'd known that I was autistic sooner, I would have been less likely to blame myself for certain things, like for example, not always getting along with my classmates. I always felt like there was something wrong with me, for not being able to get along with them because I just didn't understand most of the time what their games were or what they were talking about or why it was apparently wrong for me to want to read books all day. If I'd been diagnosed sooner than that, I think I would have had fewer problems when it comes to self-doubt and self-blame. But yeah, to answer your question very concisely, I was 10.
And what is your favorite autistic superpower?
Well, I don't know if I call them superpowers per se, but my favorite thing about being autistic, um, nowadays, it is the fact that I can stim and use stimming as a tool for relaxation, which is kind of what I've been trying to convey in this session and trying to get other people to experiment with. Because for a very long time I suppressed it and wouldn't allow myself to stim in any way because it was wrong and because it was something that made me different and there was therefore bad. Um, Another thing about being autistic that I think is good and which I've not yet mentioned at all is I love the fact that we are very blunt and direct a lot of the time. A lot of people say this as if it's a bad thing, like autistic people, they've got no filter, they're so rude. But rudeness is subjective, and honestly, to me, potentially, what people would consider polite can potentially be a rude thing. Um, People can mean to be respectful and end up coming off as condescending. So rudeness is an incredibly subjective thing. But one thing that's less subjective is, honesty. I guess honesty is subjective too, but if I weren't autistic, I feel like I would be more inhibited when it comes to saying what I think. And I hear so many 40 to 50-year-old women going, "Oh, thank goodness I don't have to give a damn about anything anymore. I'm 40 or 50 or whatever, and now I just don't care about anything, and I can do and say whatever I want." And I'm like, that's always how I've been. I don't have to be 50. I'm already there.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing with us, Nina. I'm sure lots of people are going to be super excited to hear about your experiences as an autistic person and also the connections between spirituality and autism. I don't know anybody that has come up with that combination before in a presentation, so I'm sure lots of people are really excited to hear about that.
Well, thank you for giving me this platform.
Well, of course. And thank you for being a member of the Young at Heart community because you are promoting it in a really special way through this talk. So I'm going to stop recording now.